Welcome back to the Papers Podcast, everybody. We were absolutely delighted to see many of you at a fantastic conference last week, MedEd on the Edge. And I hope we recruited a few new people to listen to our podcast. This is Linda here, and as usual, I am here with Jason.
Hi, everybody. It was great to see you at that conference in Stockholm. So many super smart, talented people. Lara was there too. It was good.
That's kind of a backhanded compliment.
No, it was like a
just
period.
A little bit,
it's not kind of. It was just a backhanded compliment.
Lara was there too. Those are both true statements.
Okay. All right. And John.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you still are. At this point, you might decide to fast forward through this episode.
Right. And for some reason, Lara is going to be very ethical today. So, Lara, tell us what you have.
Thanks, Linda. And I am going to be ethical today. This paper is a selection that I made because of actually I'm doing this entire episode because I want to get to an appendix. Doesn't that I just realized that you're all clinical. And so some of you probably just thought that that's anatomical.
Yeah. You basically said you want to get to the bottom of your small bowel.
Okay, so just moving on from there, I want to share with you a resource that I found in this paper that I think is really useful.
I'll make fun of you for being a giant nerd if that makes you feel better than the anatomy jokes.
I didn't try to make an anatomy joke. I just realized I walked into one. But anyway, but today, in order to get to that resource, one of the things we're going to talk about today is the ethical review that we do for our manuscripts and for our research when we are moving a scholarly project forward in our field and we want to collect data from human subjects. Now, here's the thing, though. We all have war stories about challenges with the IRB. So I'm going to ask each of you for a story and to give you a second to think about that. I'll give you just a couple of little stories, anecdotes of mine. Because, sometimes the IRB, the Institutional Ethical Review Board or the Institutional Review Board can be really useful and work with you. And those instances are really wonderful. And I've had those experiences when things have gone wrong in a study and the IRB was just such a stalwart of support and great thinking and stepping up and really there in support of me and the participants in the whole context. It was wonderful. On the flip side, I once waited for 2 years for a study to be approved that didn't have any patient data. It wasn't intrusive in terms of experiences or personal narratives from participants. It was a survey, actually. It was one of the few times in my life I tried to do a survey. After 2 years, I gave up because, I thought the hard part was going to be getting the right people in the institution on board. That wasn't hard at all. What was hard was getting the IRB to approve to send it to everybody. They were digging their heels in and this was going to be too much. And so I gave up. So, but those are two of my experiences. What are your experiences, Linda, Jason, John?
Well, I must say, I agree ethics review boards can be good. I've had them extend a study or allow me to use data in a different way, sort of when we've had some interesting thoughts. We have two ethics processes, one at a hospital and one at a university. I won't say which is which, but one looks solely at ethics. And the expectation is that there will have been a scientific review beforehand. The other does the scientific review because, of course, being scientifically sound is part of being ethical. But they sometimes miss the mark. Like the time that there was a qualitative study and one person on the ethics review board said, but you only have 10 subjects. What do you mean? You can't make any decisions based on 10 subjects' data. That's a time when the ethics review board went wrong.
So
Thanks, Linda.
I've had all of those experiences too. This is something that really concerns me because a lot of health professions education studies worldwide are just, they have negative interactions with IRBs, with ethics review boards. I've had that whole gamut. I've had amazing interactions where they made a study I was involved in better I've had interactions where the IRB is completely indifferent. There's one institution that is in my world that treats every single HPE study as a quality improvement study, and we're exempt. We're exempt automatically the moment you submit. That's also not ideal, right? And then there's another IRB in my life that makes everything so hard. We had a resident research project that was a simple survey of colleagues that similarly got held up for so many months that it actually threatened this person's graduation because they didn't have a project done.
Oh,
I know, and that's heartbreaking. And that's despite everybody intervening. It's not just a power differential. It was methodologists intervening and so on, a survey. So this is an area of frustration for us all.
I've had actually pretty good experiences at my institution. I run a research center, so when I first started, I was having some pretty frustrating experiences, and I spent some time meeting with the co-chairs to understand their approach, to educate them about the type of education research we do, and to meet with their manager to understand their operations piece. And every couple of years, I have to review that and go back and reestablish some of those shared understandings and mental models. The most challenging study that I've ever personally run as a senior author, we actually took a consecutive series of patients in our emergency departments and got a 10-second video of them in the initial stages of the resuscitation to add as a study for diagnostic reasoning. And so you can imagine the challenge of actual patient identifiers in extremis in the process of consenting all of that. It was very challenging, but I had a friend on the IRB who came back after and said, wow, that was a pretty hairy meeting, but you're good to go. Prior to building those relationships with the REB, though, we used to get silly things like saying, show us your sample size calculation. I was like, this is a qualitative study. That's a non sequitur. And so they just saw it through the lens of, we do clinical trials, we do drug trials, we do diagnostic and therapeutic trials. And we need to see some stats somewhere from the EBM literature. And so it was a conversation in a two-way education. I learned a lot about what they were worried about, and they learned a lot about how we imagine education research. And I got to say, I don't have a negative story to say.
That's good.
It's interesting, right? Because we're all in the North American context. I can only imagine what it must be like in other places too. The sheer volume of variation, of variability across. If you look at any given journal of medical education, within each manuscript, you could have someone say we were exempt, and exempt means something different in every single location, like in each of those studies. So what's interesting about this paper that we're going to look at today is that the authors were interested in trying to understand how the ethics and ethical review decisions are made. And so one of the things that they started with, and I think this is a program of research, and I just tip of the hat for it. This study is looking to review decisions and ethical considerations for health professions education researchers as they are reported in our journals, right? So great place to start. Let's see what's out there and do some analysis of how we're talking about ethics. Maybe this is something we can start the conversation with by looking at what's publicly available. So who are these authors? This is Schutt, Faisal, Falkens, and Wouters, all of whom are in the Netherlands. And the paper is called The Reporting of Ethical Review and Ethical Considerations in Articles Published in Medical Education Journals. So this article was published in the journal called Medical Education, and it's from September of 2023, so of this year. So let's talk about how they pulled off this study. Now, hold on to your hats, friends, because this is just a beautiful study design. They looked at papers published in 2020, so just 1 year, and they looked across 8 health professions education journals. Those ones are Academic Medicine, Advances in Health Sciences Education, BMC MedEd, Medical Education Online, Medical Teacher, Perspectives on Medical Education, and Teaching and Learning in Medicine. You know what I love about that list? It's some of my favorite journals, just all in one sentence. That just makes me happy. Anyway, they included any paper that reported an outcomes that were based on research using data derived from human participants. So if they got data from humans, they looked at that paper. It met inclusion. And that's really clever, right? Because that means that the innovation reports that can involve data from students or learners or faculty members, or perspective papers, or any kind of paper that has human-generated data was relevant, not just research papers. And I think that's really clever because so often our IRB, institutional review boards or ethical review boards, they only want to know about your research study. But many of our manuscripts involve data and it's not a research study. So I think that was really a clever choice. So they extracted data in 4 areas. First was study characteristics, demographics. So this is the country where the study was done, the type of article, etc. Second was information about the review process and the outcome. So this is a statement about the process. Was it approved or exempt? And information about the type of review board, even the final number if it was assigned, so that kind of content. Third, they extracted data about the reporting structure about the ethical approval. So was there, for instance, a heading in the manuscript where ethical considerations are explicitly described? Was it in the main text or, at the back in the footnote sort of section where the acknowledgements are? You often have an ethics section. Is that where it was? What ethical considerations were taken into account? How was it described? Is it described? So the last piece of data, or the last kind of data they extracted. Fourth, they looked at data on key ethical features. Was, for instance, the Helsinki Declaration mentioned? Was informed consent reported? Were incentives provided? Those sorts of things. So in terms of analysis, it was just descriptive statistics. Nothing fancy, nothing too convoluted. I thought it was really quite nicely done. So I'm sure that won't bias you out at all, but I'll ask for your opinions just the same. Let's go, John, Linda, Jason.
I don't have any critical flaw. I think they did great work. And I got to imagine, having done a bunch of systematic reviews, doing data extraction from nearly 1,000 manuscripts.
Yeah.
Oof, that would just make me sad. I have a couple of funny little points, I guess, in terms of their methods. First, they didn't actually have to go to their IRB. I love that delicious little irony for their study. But they do, in best practices, take a cue from their results and actually describe the ethical elements of what they're doing. And so they do model in their actual behavior on research ethics, good ethics in there. They got a little bit hung up on the differences between ERBs, REBs, IRBs, and I never understood what they were talking about. They're all synonymous in my worldview, but they seem to have some differentiation. So I'm just flagging for maybe an international audience whether there is some differentiation between your ethics review board or their research ethics board or an institutional review board. I don't know what the difference is, but in my worldview, they're all one and the same. And before we get to the actual meat of it, I would just flag that they only found 800 research articles in the year 2020 in the top health professions education journals. And that for me was a bit of I can't believe it's only 800, which means that even the top journals are only publishing 8 research articles per issue. And that that's an order of magnitude off for what, maybe not an order of magnitude off, but a substantive difference than what I thought was going to happen. So I was a little surprised that we're maybe not doing as much original research as I might have thought.
Is that right, John? I thought most of them were excluded because they didn't have human subjects by their definition.
I do define medical students and nursing students as humans, but we have seen REB statements before that this is non-human subject research. And so it's
right.
exempt. We've
For
seen
med
that in a
students.
couple of papers.
Yeah, we've seen
Too
it.
funny.
Yeah.
So first, John, I'd like you to know that you need to go back to grade 2 for arithmetic, because I think it works out to 2 research studies per issue, per week,
Oof.
right? So yeah, anyway, it's not very much. I agree with that. A couple of things. First of all, I'm not surprised that this is a group from, I think it was from the Netherlands, because they were one of the first groups in general, and the NVMO, the MedEd, the Dutch Medical Education Society, were one of the first groups to actually start talking about ethics and publishing about ethics. So that's not unusual. When you were describing it as anything to do with human subjects, I started to think about, what about those document reviews? And by the way, that may be why the numbers are low when it comes to human subjects, because scoping reviews and systematic reviews and all of that, that's research. But do you need ethics for that?
Not human subjects.
Yeah. So I think that's what brought down the numbers. But you got to be careful, because some of those document reviews could relate to humans, even if those humans are medical students.
I agree with Lara. It's hard for me to say, but
No, it's
That's
not.
not really, no. No,
I know.
this is a beautiful, elegant study. It's so clear. It's easy to follow the logic. It's easy to follow what they did. It really is a sweet study. I agree with you. It looks like somebody's program of research. The authors they have cool affiliations. A whole bunch of them are on the NVMO's National Ethics Board. That's kind of cool. One of them's from an institute called Learn. That's pretty cool. My only hesitation about their study design, that maybe if I was in a study group like this, tackling this, is how extensive all the features are that they're looking for. And I'm not sure that I agree that all of them are reasonable. Like, we wouldn't have enough geography in every paper to include all the things that they're asking for. That's just my opinion as I read it. Having said that, just beautiful methods.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that point, Jason, because I too had some thoughts about that. But first, let's take a look at some of the results and a little bit of the discussion. Out of the 2,400 papers they found that met inclusion, just under half of them, so 955, met inclusion criteria. Of those, 85% of the papers that reported on data from humans were research papers. So that's not really a surprise. And that leaves 15% from other columns, right, from perspectives or innovations. All of the papers, of all of them, 83% mentioned a review by an ethical review board or an institutional review board or some variation thereof. So we're largely reporting. That's good. But that's also where sort of the consistency starts to end. Half of the papers mentioned being approved. 18% said they were exempt. In the research papers, nearly 8% said they were reviewed, but they never tell you what the decision was. Just, we were reviewed and cliffhanger ending. Only 17% of the articles had a section in the paper's methods that specifically talked about ethics. But in the research papers, 84% had a section at the end near the appendixes and references, right, where there were declarations or some kind of appendix that reported on ethics. So the kinds of ethical considerations that were reported is also really different in each of the papers, right, across these. So statements about informed consent procedures, that was present in about 64% of the research articles, most often with focus group studies. In those papers, if you did a focus group, 84% of the time you talked about informed consent. So, it also really depends on what kind of research you're doing and what kind of characteristics are there. In contrast, some papers had talked about voluntary participation was described. So if you did a survey and you replied, it was assumed you volunteered, right? Like that was part of that. Incentives were reported 13% of the time. That for me is a personal exhale moment because I never have grant money to give people participation incentives. And if only 13% are doing it, that's kind of like, sweet, great. Nobody else has money either. Now, another point I want to highlight is how qualitative studies were noted for having detailed descriptions of the context and also having a reflexivity paragraph. And that reflexivity paragraph often made note of the relationships between researchers and participants and how power dynamics in those relationships were attended to. I think that's a good catch. That's a good thing to be thinking about when you're doing qualitative research in terms of the power dynamics, the ethical responsibility, because it also, and from a scientific perspective, it also changes the quality of the data you're getting. Just a few other points. These are from the discussion. I just want to highlight a few things. The authors noted that the articles that reported on focus groups stated that data was, some papers talked about collecting data anonymously. And that should give us all cause for pause. Because if you've been in a focus group, that's not anonymous, right? I see you. And so this then becomes a signal for, dear reviewer, dear editor, that maybe they don't know what they're talking about in terms of their methods descriptions or understanding what these different kinds of research.
I wonder if people confuse words, like it's the English words, right? Like confidential versus anonymous. And maybe people use them synonymous.
Great point. Yeah. But they're not, right? Confidential versus anonymous are different things.
Totally. Yeah.
Great point. Yeah. The authors also noted that the reporting of ethical approval is higher for research articles than for other articles, which, might be a function of what reviewers and editors and journals have made as expectations. That you have to do that in order to be considered for publication. It's sort of a check. It's one of the check boxes that you have to to fill. So how much is it of this is people trying to be ensuring that they're doing ethical research versus how much of this is structural requirement? The only other thing I want to highlight is, wait for it, the reason I picked this paper, Appendix number 3. In this appendix, the authors provide a list of all the ethical considerations that were part of their study. And what I would like to suggest to you is that this is one of those things you print off and you put it on the whiteboard beside your desk and you just hold on to it. Not all of them are going to be relevant. Not all of them should be part of your paper because, as you pointed out, Jason, we don't have word counts that go on forever.
Yeah.
But this appendix has a lot of important pieces that should be part of your consideration when you're doing research, as you're trying to make decisions, even when you're thinking about research design. That some of these considerations at that front end will help you ensure that your data is quite solid at the back end. So I'm going to suggest to all of our listeners, if the only thing that you're interested in is, looking for something very tangible today, download Appendix 3 from this manuscript because it's useful. It is just a useful piece of resource material that you can have, that you can share with others. Because there it is, everything you need to be thinking about, anything that you could be thinking about from an ethical perspective. Sincerely, I think it's just gorge. But that's my opinion. What do you all think? Let's go Jason, John, then Linda.
Love the paper, love the results. I agree with John. They're a little bit hung up on some distinctions between the various acronyms of ethics boards. That was a head scratcher to me. Maybe I don't know. Maybe there's something that's beyond my knowledge of that. And I'm really glad to hear you say that the value of the appendix is that it's like the universe of things that you might consider, as opposed to here's all the things you need to have in your paper, because I thought that was going to be impossible. So I agree with your framing. Handing this out or having this handy when you're doing your design or writing up your manuscript, super useful, actually. It's really good.
I struggled a little bit with the who cares part of this paper.
Yeah.
The appendix actually is excellent. And you can almost use it as not a calculation, but almost like an equation. This plus this plus this plus this equals that. A very well-described ethical consideration. You could imagine if you have a reputable REB, then all these things are being taken into consideration and simply saying this has been approved, here's the REB, and you can fact check it if you want as a reader. But that requires a bit more. This makes things much more obvious. I don't think the word count is massive. I think it's probably 2 sentences to capture everything here. And so I like this. It's useful. I would say it's unfortunate that it's buried in the appendix, because that's really what the who cares part of this paper is. And so a bit of the bearing of the lead. We've talked about that before. Here's my little soapbox I want to get standing up on, is that unlike my institution where we have a good relationship and we have expedited review, we have QI venues for scholarship, and then we have full review for studies that may expose participants to harm to make sure that we're doing good ethical practice. And so we have 3 different streams. With other institutions, I sometimes worry that they lump education scholarship in with all of the other drug trials and therapeutic trials. And for me, I'm got to ask, for the most part, when we kind of address issues of coercion, privacy, and or psychological harm, we do a good job, I think, in the education research community, because I don't see things that make me blow my hair back and get excited. But I do worry that we conflate an extra step that just adds to the challenge, adds to the frustration, puts more work onto the back of the researchers, to my point of, for what problem are we creating a solution? And I wonder if sometimes we just we're now adding an extra step of making this even more obvious, even more rigorous, which I think is okay. But was there ever a problem in the education research community before where we were causing real harm to our learners? For the most part, we're saying, hey, we want to teach you something. Did you learn anything? And you didn't? Well, I don't think that's a big harm. And I know that there's all a case study about the psychological harm of some of the studies that we might be doing, particularly when we're exploring certain elements of what it means to be a health professions trainee, et cetera. And I get that we want to be thoughtful about privacy and the risk that we promote to people who participate in our studies, and I get the issues of coercion, the power differential. But for the most part, we're not offering people interventions that might actually lead to their death. And so I just want to be cautious about, as we add rigor and rigor and rigor, have we missed a bit of the point?
So I've got to say, I'll agree with you for parts of that, but where I think we could have harm and where they actually address it is in the recruitment of learners and the potential for coercion, particularly if there's a relationship between the researcher who happens to be a teacher or in a position of power over a learner. And it's interesting because much of that recruitment or pressure to participate, as they call it, is not as much of an issue, I think, in some other studies, and not in the same way when there's that personal relationship between teacher and learner. The challenge there, of course, is that if you're a really good program director or teacher and you've developed something or you've innovated and you want to research on it, who's going to ask the learners if it's not you? But then, of course, there may be bias in the learner and they may be coerced. Couple of other comments. One, they seem to make a big fuss about having the ethics part at the end rather than in the text. I think that's just a stylistic thing. I don't think it matters as long as it's there. So who cares? And the final thing is I learned a new word. It's a long one. Took me 2 seconds to read it and get it. Pseudonymization. Pseudonymization. That's what you do with data when you try and make it so it can't be identified. And now you say that.
De-identification is way easier to say.
Yeah, I know. Why don't you? Yeah, I'd like you each to say it 3 times fast.
Just before, if Linda's done, I also failed to highlight the fact that 15% of studies were labeled as Sol's ethics comments. That's a little surprising to me from these 8 journals.
Really surprising. As a former DE, the system at most major journals has a box where you have to check this has been approved or has been deemed non-research status. And if you don't do that, you can't get through. So you either have to lie.
Yeah, but is that for research papers or for perspectives or innovations? It's some of those other columns that would have been caught because these, for inclusion purposes, aren't necessarily required to fill in the same box, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so a couple of things I want to make sure that I just underscore. I do think it's important that we have ethical review for all of our work. I think I agree. I don't think education's the den of evil people sitting there thinking, what can I get away with?
I was dying to know what metaphor you're going to go for, the den of evil people.
The den of evil people.
Dear cardiology friends, or as we like to call you, the den of evil people in your drug trials.
But what I do think is that part of what keeps us honest, part of what keeps us on the right side of the line always and consistently is knowing that we're held accountable. And I think we're held accountable for power differentials. We're held accountable for the fact that sometimes we ask questions that are hard, and that does something to our participants, right? When we ask them about, for instance, their identity struggles, that we could be picking at scabs there, right? Or when we're studying hard topics like getting bullied, we're picking at scabs. And so we need to make sure that we have support systems in place for those individuals and that we do that consistently. I also just want to point out that this appendix number 3 is very useful for you, dear listener, if you're doing research and you're doing research design. I also want to suggest, John, that this might be one of those appendices that you take the next time you have to go talk to your institutional review board to make sure that we're all on the same page and we all understand what we're doing. Because you want to cut off those people who are like, I'm sorry, you have 10 participants, or I want to see your power calculation for a qualitative study. This tells them, listen, there's research that says these are some of the things you should be worried about for some of that work. And so I think this document also serves the purpose of being an educational tool that we can bring to some of those very boards that sometimes are having us work really hard just to ask a survey question about, did you like the flipped classroom, right? So trying to keep the work of the IRB work commensurate to the risk that it is. So with all of that said, my friends, this takes us to our voting, which I do against my will and on pain of having, well, not death, but having to listen to John complain to me incessantly about how I need to play along on these sorts of things. So with that,
The
let's
REB
do
has deemed this
methods.
to be a non-lethal intervention. So just do your job.
But
does
it's
it
not
involve human
anonymous,
subjects?
nor is it confidential. In fact, it's not even pseudonymized.
And I'm going to
Linda,
suggest it ain't
boom.
science. So really, it doesn't even go. Oh, there we are. All right. So let's do methods. Let's go John, Linda, Jason.
4. No concerns.
Why? Why not 5?
Why 4 then? Why wouldn't it be a
Okay,
5?
5. I can't really pick
Oh,
apart
that was
this too
easy.
much.
That was really
Yeah.
easy. You must be tired or well fed and you're just happy about it.
I think
Not
it's
well
a 5 because it's, they used very straightforward stats. They explained everything well. It wasn't complicated, and they addressed everything, including having an ethical statement,
Yeah,
even though it
it's a
wasn't
5.
needed.
Thanks, Linda.
Easy peasy.
I agree. Yeah, it's a 5. From a research design, it's really well done. Let's go in the other direction. Educational impact. John, Linda, Jason.
That would not be the
that's
other
the way
direction,
I
but
went
I
the
can
first
go
time.
ahead.
That's
You're tired.
why do I try to be clever at this end of night? All right, fine, whatever. John, Linda, Jason. Now you have to go first, John.
I'm going to give it a 4. I think their appendix is really useful. It articulated the equation, which I would never say it's a cookbook type of thing, but it gives you all the necessary ingredients to put together and to consider when you're thinking about what are the ethics behind what I'm doing. But they really bury it. They bury it in the supplemental material.
Yeah.
And I think a good chunk of the audience won't miss that. I would not routinely go and read all the supplementary material unless the good Dr. Varpio said, read this. It's really important when we talk about the paper.
So I'm going to quote Jason this time. So, John, why didn't you give it a 5?
Because the layout of the manuscript probably loses some of the punch and impact.
Okay. I got to say, I gave it a 4, and I really don't know why I didn't give it a 5, except that I
Because
don't
the
know.
scale means nothing. It's just
Hey,
random.
same reasons, and this is something that I would pull off the shelf for a learner and say, look at this, learn how to write.
This is a 3 for me, using the sacred scale. Because I'm not going to use this on an everyday basis. It's good paper. I agree with John. They buried the lead. That appendix is useful. Awareness that this paper exists. Search for it if I really needed it for a specific conversation. But it's not like a go-to day-to-day thing. The appendix as that table is useful, and everybody listening to this should probably have it handy. It's 3.
So I'm kind of similar opinion to all of you. So I think the actual manuscript itself is middle of the road. It's not going to change our practice on big ways and things like that. So I think the paper itself is a 3, but I'm going to give this as a whole a 4 because of that appendix, because it's so useful, because it holds so much opportunity really for all of us to use it, not only for reporting, but also design. Linda, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so it's not a go-to paper. It's a go-to appendix.
True fact. That's how I see it. But I've learned that you shouldn't make comments about appendix unless you actually understand what one is. So I'm going to just walk sideways. I'm just going to crab walk away from that. Anyway, so listeners, we'd be really interested in knowing what your experiences are with ethical review at your institution. Have you too waited for 2 years before you gave up? Maybe your board comes and talks to you when they have questions to make it a little bit faster. Maybe your institution worries a lot about commas and semicolons. I've had that experience too with some different boards. Write to us. Tell us about your experiences. We'd love to hear about it. You can find us on the internet at thepaperspodcast.com. Yes?
Try again.
You can find us on the internet at Papers. No, I don't know how you find us on the internet.
So first you say, Dear Siri. So you can find us
Can you
at
find a podcast?
paperspodcast.com. You can write to us at thepaperspodcast@gmail.com. Or you can find us on any of your podcast players, and that should give you the entry back to our website.
Thanks, John. At some point, I promise that I will get all of that straight in my mind. For some reason, I can do the science part with more ease than I can remember our email address. Before we go, I want to do a little shout out, if that's okay, friends, because I really did have a great time at MedEd on the Edge in Stockholm last week. And I had the opportunity to do a little bit of a consult and to meet two scholars and met many people there. But I want to give a little shout out to two people specifically. One is Pernilla Lund and the other is Joelle Goldman, both of whom work in the Swedish context. They're both part of the Swedish contingent who are at the meeting. And they're doing some great work and just the most thoughtful questions, the most sincere desire to do really great work. And if you have that kind of earnest desire to do the best you can, I will always take a few extra minutes and be late for the reception so that I can make sure that we're answering all your questions if I can and providing you resources and those sorts of things. So to Pernilla and Joelle, I just want to give you a thumbs up. Keep it up. You guys are doing great work over there. And so with that, friends, the time has come for us to wrap up today. And so with that, I'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening.
Wait, before we go, I want to give a shout out to two of our biggest, longest running fans who we saw last week. We saw Glenn Posner from Ottawa, Master of Simulation. And we saw Christina Zara, who just got a new job, again, on the West Coast of North America. And it was great to see both of them face to face and, talk podcasty stuff. I also want to mention that I saw a survey of a group of medical educators, and it was a total non sequitur, but someone in the survey was talking about something else. And they said, whatever happened to that group, that did the podcast, the MedEd Journal Club podcast thing? And it's like us. That's us. And we're alive. We're on the podcast. We're on Papers podcast now. So please spread the word. People don't know where we are. And we'd like to rebuild our community. Thanks, everybody. Take care. You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.